The gentleman from Alexandria, Mr. Levine.
Mr. Speaker, will the gentleman from Shenandoah yield for a question?
Will the gentleman yield?
I yield.
Gentleman yields.
Mr. Speaker, I would ask the gentleman whether or not it's true that under current law it would be prohibited for a grantee of the fund to give a $100,000 donation to the governor while the governor was deciding whether or not to approve that donation. Is that true that under current law that's prohibited?
Mr. Speaker, I believe that the prohibitions relate to the period in which the award is being considered and the I think the time, some time period thereafter.
And I have a follow-up question, Mr. Speaker, if the gentleman would yield.
Will the gentleman yield?
I yield.
My question for the patron, Mr. Speaker, for the gentleman from Shenandoah, is whether under this current bill that would change the law, and even though it would be disclosed, would allow someone who wanted to influence a very bad governor, not at all the current governor, but someone who wanted to influence a very bad governor to give a donation of $100,000 while the negotiations are pending or right after the award is given. And even though it would be disclosed, that would then be legal under this bill. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I think that's absolutely right. And the considerations here, you know, when we passed that bill last year, that was certainly our intent, was to prohibit the very stark, clear examples of undue influence that may exist. The problem is that we created a number of unintended consequences that were not foreseen, that weren't as clear and weren't as readily apparent. And so VEDP was very concerned about the unintended consequences, and they can certainly articulate the many examples that they came up with much better than I can. But it was not to prevent the kind of example that the gentleman's using. It's to rectify any number of other unintended consequences that have arisen since then. So instead of prohibiting it, it puts it all out there for the world to see on a regular basis, so that any undue influence, that there will be consequences to be had for that politically for whomever is willing to engage in that sort of consideration.
Mr. Speaker, speaking to the bill.
Gentleman has the floor.
I understand what this bill is trying to do. I am fully supportive of getting rid of all the unintended consequences. I still think there's a loophole in the bill. I'm going to vote against it, but I do think this bill can be fixed so that we don't have the unintended consequences, but we still prohibit what would clearly, to me, be a conflict. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Shenandoah, Mr.
Speaking to the bill.
Gentleman has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, I agree with the gentleman, and if there were a perfect way to do these things that someone could easily come up with, we would certainly adopt the easy path every time we can. But it is very difficult to write legislation that covers every possibility, that also doesn't capture a whole bunch of activity that we didn't intend to. And this was the problem that when we were first going through the ethics legislation, talking about, it was constantly reporters or citizens would ask me, why don't you just say no gifts? Because it sounds so simple. Well, I would say, if I drive an hour to go give a speaking engagement and someone at the speaking engagement offers me a bottle of water so I can clear my throat before I give my speech that I just drove an hour for, am I able to accept that bottle of water, or is that not allowed under your no gifts theory? And universally, everyone thinks that is perfectly reasonable, that I could accept a bottle of water to clear my throat before I give a speech. And if we start doing that, then we're starting to do the very balancing test that we tried to achieve in the court's ethics subcommittee when we were working through this for hours on end. So that was one example of how hard it is to get this right and to try to prevent the exact types of things that the gentleman is talking about without getting into things that we didn't intend. And so I'm happy to work with the gentleman. If he has a magic answer on how he can get with the folks at VEDP and see how we can maybe fix those unintended consequences, I'll be happy to join him in that effort. Thank you.